Welcome to this webinar of the Jerusalem Press Club, JPC, with Professor Mordechai Kremnitzer, who will speak about the democratic and constitutional crisis in Israel. For those of you who are here for the first time, you can watch the previous webinars on YouTube, and you'll get a link to this one immediately after we finish, and it will be also on YouTube very quickly. We created a WhatsApp group for this series, so anybody who wants to be in the loop can join. And stay tuned to our next webinar starting on Sunday. I want to thank my colleagues at the JPC for facilitating this webinar. Professor Kremnitzer will start with a short introduction, and then we'll open up for Q&A. You are all on mute, so please type your questions on chat, and Professor Kremnitzer will answer them if he reads them. If not, I will facilitate. Professor Kremnitzer is a senior fellow at the Israel Democracy Institute. He runs the Center for Democratic Values and Institutions, Center for Security and Democracy. He's a professor emeritus and former dean of the Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, director of the Israel Press Council. He served on many government committees, including the Committee to Examine the Use of Force by the Police and others. And he's an expert on criminal law, public law, military law, human rights, and more. Professor Kremnitzer, please.
Thank you, Uri. Good morning. The crisis that we are in is evolving. When Uri asked me to join you in this talk, we were in a different situation than we are now, some hours afterwards. Because if before 24 hours, the main issue was whether Israel will have a government, it was not clear, and there was a good chance that we are going to be an additional period of time without a stable government. It is becoming clear now that we are going to have a government, and a government with a clear majority in the Knesset. So from this point of view, we came out of one type of crisis, but the question is whether we are not entering into a different kind of crisis, and I'm afraid that we are. And I will make two brief points about this possible crisis. One is that at the end, democracy is based on the trust of people in their leaders, and in the trust that there is meaning to the process of elections and to the action of elections. Now, when the party of Benny Gans is breaking entirely all its promises to the Israeli public, to its voters, when it's trampling all the principles that it vowed loyalty to, the question is what remains from this essential trust of the people to the parties and to the leaders. So this is one point. And the other point is from the point of view of the rule of law. It seems that what Gans did creates a difficult situation to the rule of law of Israel. People may say now that actually Gans misled the High Court of Justice, pretending to lead a 61 camp in the Knesset in order to have a change of rule And actually the court, when it ruled against the Speaker of the Knesset, Edelstein, based its ruling on the decision of Edelstein not to allow election of a new speaker, based on the idea that this is against democracy, against the majority, and against the possibility to have a change of a democratic government, replacing one government, replacing an outgoing government. Now it seems that all this was not taking place in reality, and what we see is that Gans taking upon himself the role of the speaker without really wanting to be the speaker of the Knesset, just in order to join himself and part of his party with the Likud party. And what will make it even more awkward is that probably Gans and his party will have to vote for Edelstein coming back to his position as a speaker after Edelstein decided to defy a court ruling, an act that should disqualify him from being a speaker of the Knesset, but he will probably be elected again to this position. Now, the second element of the rule of law that I want to mention is that if Gans, that his main point to the Israeli electorate was that it is inconceivable that a prime minister can be at the same time a prime minister, an acting prime minister, and at the same time a defendant in a court defending himself from serious criminal charges. If he is now a member in the government that this same person, Netanyahu, is leading as the prime minister, the question is what remains from this principle, and whether it is conceivable that the proceedings against Netanyahu will ever take place. And I venture to say that it will not take place. I think that as long as we are deep in a crisis, and the crisis is not only a health crisis, it is also a developing very serious economical and social crisis, nobody would see it as a possibility that the prime minister heading this, dealing with the crisis, will be at the same time a defendant in a court. That going out of the crisis will take a long time, and I don't think that we will see Netanyahu ever being defended in a criminal proceedings. This applies also to the ministers. Some of the ministers in the government are in different stages of legal proceedings. Nothing will come out of it. So the rule of law, I think in Israel, the equality before the law is in deep trouble.
I have to ask you to move a bit backwards from the screen. Okay. Yeah, that's the best frame we have. You just said something very serious, that you don't think Netanyahu will ever go to court. Why? Please explain why. Because of the coronavirus or other reasons?
It starts with the coronavirus, and as I said, it's not only the health crisis, it's going to be a very serious economic and social crisis. And actually, Gans, in the way he joins the government, is strengthening the idea that only Netanyahu can deal with this crisis. Because if we watch the news, Gans is not asking for any ministry that will have anything to do with the crisis. So he is saying Netanyahu is the only Israeli leader who can deal with the crisis. Now, dealing with the crisis and being a defendant in court are not compatible. They cannot happen together. I think dealing with the crisis will take 2 or 3 years, and then some way will be found in order to stay proceedings, to give pardon, I don't think that the trial will ever take place. And the same I think about the other ministers who are in different stages. And I think the fact that Gans is sitting in Netanyahu's government is sending a clear message. This stuff of criminal proceedings, political corruption is not really important. Clearly, it's not important when the country is in serious troubles. And actually, he is strengthening those voters who were saying Netanyahu may be corrupt, but this is not really essential. It's not really important. He is such a great leader that this should not, we should not pay too much attention to this legal niceties. So in joining Netanyahu's government, Gans, willingly or unwillingly, is supporting this climate, this mood.
But you are expert on constitutional law, but aren't you talking a bit politics here? Because you talked about the breach of trust that by the action of Gans. But isn't that what politics is about? Deals, give and take. Begin promised he will, when he retired, he will move to Sinai, and then Sadat comes and they gave him all of Sinai back for peace. So aren't we mixing constitutional issues with politics?
Well, we are, of course, we are mixing. You cannot analyze a political constitutional crisis without looking into the political map and the political implications.
No, the question is if you have certain affiliations, certain inclination here, or certain prism, political prism through which you analyze constitutional issues.
Of course, everybody speaks from his personal prism, and so do I. I'm not claiming to speak from some neutral, objective point in the sky. I'm not pretending to be this kind of speaker. What I want to say to the point that you made, I think that we never saw somebody who is breaking all the main tenets of his campaign to become a prime minister. This has no precedent. The depths of the level of doing exactly the opposite to what you preached before, and the special tenor of the campaign of Gans was that it was not political in the hard sense. It was moral in its basic nature. And this kind of morality is now being thrown out of the window.
We went straight into the current crisis, but there was one, things happened so fast that we don't even remember, but there was a crisis which preceded it, and that was the refusal of the Speaker of the Knesset to obey the ruling of the Supreme Court. But some people claim that the Supreme Court exceeded its jurisdiction by doing that. What is your opinion about it? Because there's a long argument that since the constitutional revolution of President of the Supreme Court, Barak, the Supreme Court took more and more rights or went into the territory of the Knesset, of the government, without a good reason.
Well, I think that according to the factual premises that were presented to the court did the right thing. I think that the fact that the Speaker of the House has the power to decide when to convene the Knesset and what to put on its order of discussion does not give him an absolute and arbitrary power. He still is under the principles of administrative law. He cannot act for his own interest. Nobody is allowed to act for his own interest. Nobody is allowed, when he is performing a state position, to bring in his specific political views. And in this sense, I think that the court was not intervening just in something that is an internal management of the Knesset, but goes much beyond it to the issue of democratic principles, when 61 members of the Knesset demand from the Speaker of the Knesset, who is just a temporary speaker, who was not elected by this Knesset to this position. They want to convene the Knesset and they want to have a new speaker. And the tradition of the Knesset was that this is usually done in the first meeting of the Knesset, and the role of the outgoing chair is a role for several hours in order to enable a replacement. If this is a tradition, and if this is what is asked by the majority of the Knesset, 61 is the majority of the Knesset, the speaker cannot say, I know better. I decide to defy the majority. This goes against the basic tenets of democracy. And I think, therefore, the court was justified in intervention. And I would like to rely on the position of Professor Daniel Friedman, one of the most elaborate critiques of the court and its activism. And he said before the decision of the court that the court should intervene, and he supported this intervention after the fact. So I say, if Friedman is justifying the court, everybody else should also do it.
I think it's a rare occasion that you agree with Friedman on anything.
Or Friedman agrees with me.
Aren't we at least sure that the idea of oversight, of the Knesset being able to overrule the rulings of the Supreme Court is now put aside, because Gans and whatever remains of his party will not allow that?
Well, I think that it's not clear to what extent Gans will be able to protect things that he stated in his campaign, because I think it will be easy for Netanyahu to have a majority in the Knesset, even without the 15 members of parliament of Gans. And so maybe that bad initiatives will come not from the government, but will come from the Knesset, and they may have a majority. So I don't think that Gans will be able to protect such initiatives. But I think that it may be the case that as long as the crisis is going on, Netanyahu will not allow these initiatives to take place. This is more reasonable at the moment. But in the case that Netanyahu decides to allow such an initiative, I think that Gans is too optimistic that he will stop it.
There's another issue or campaign promise and that is to pass a law that will not allow a Knesset member who's facing charges of bribery, breach of trust, and fraud to run for prime minister. So this will be shelved as well.
This is dead. This is clearly dead. Not only is it dead, but actually by joining Netanyahu, Gans admits that this principle of this idea is not valid.
You know, we're talking about such serious thing, but we already take them, you know, things that are usual. You feel there is an erosion in the sensitivity to rule of law and the norms. We are in a slippery slope.
Clearly, that we are in a slippery slope. I think that if you asked people 10 years ago, can you imagine, and give them a scenario without knowing who is the political leader, asking them a question in abstract. Is it possible that the person who is charged with 3 very serious charges, among them bribery, committed during his term as prime minister, that such a person can continue to be a prime minister and can also be appointed by the president to convene a government, etc., etc.? I think that 90% of the people asked this question will tell you this is something that comes from a wild imagination. It cannot take place in reality. And now we see that reality is eating the norms, is devouring the norms, changing the norms, changing the perspective. And what we thought is not normal, cannot take place, becomes normalcy, part of our lives. So clearly we are in a slippery slope here. I would like to mention one additional point. I think that Netanyahu went to have such an agreement with Gans because he wanted to prevent this law that you mentioned before. This is the main initiative of going with Gans. And Netanyahu, in order to prevent this law, was ready to pay what I see as an unreasonable political price, because to give Gans and his people the same number of ministers as the 58 of Netanyahu is entirely out of reason. Even in politics, 15 does not equal 58. And I don't think that it will hold. Unreasonable things have the tendency to collapse. I think it will not hold. And it also looks very bad from the point of view of the ministers coming from Gans' party. All his members of Knesset will become immediately ministers.
These people don't have most of them don't have any experience in anything.
Exactly. And to get 15 ministries is really inconceivable. And it looks as if, not in the legal sense, but in the moral public sense, that it was a kind of a bribery transaction. You will go with me because I am buying you by giving you ministries.
But there's another point here, and that is all these people who are supposed to act as Knesset members will be ministers. So the Knesset, or 1/4 of the Knesset, together with the others, are in the executive branch, not in the legislative one.
Yes. And also the opposition will be weakened, because if the main opposition now is going to be Lapid, nobody will be able to forget that yesterday Lapid was the best partner and friend of Gans, and he was the one that invited the Israeli public to support Gans. So the question of what reliability will Lapid have now as leader of the opposition is also an issue.
There's a question from Fabiana Magri.
Yeah.
I'm not sure this is your professional expertise, but definitely a political one, you can answer it. How come a strong character such as Chief of Staff of the General Staff can collapse so miserably? Maybe he was threatened or bribed by Likud or Bibi?
Well, I think that it's not important what the position you have and what career you led. It does not say a lot about your personality. Also, military commanders may have weak personalities. The fact that they were military commanders and even chief of staffs does not prove that they have a strong personality. It depends on the personality of the person, and I think there is a big difference between roles in the army and being involved in politics. And I think one of the things that is acting against Gans is the fact that he lacks any political experience that may mean that to jump from a position of chief of staff immediately to the aspiration to become number one, the prime minister, maybe it's too big a jump.
A question from Itai Flesher. Do you think it's likely that Ayman Odeh will be the leader of the opposition? If not, do you think the Arab voter turnout will drop next time?
Well, we don't know at the moment who will be the leader of the opposition. There may be a competition between Odeh and Lapid, and the numbers will decide who will be the leader of the opposition. I think that the assumption in the question that this result is going to harm the Israeli Arabs and their political representation seems to me correct or reasonable, because they were hoping for a change, and they were hoping that their political power will allow them to be important players in the political sphere. And this is probably not going to happen. And one should also remember that the campaign was a very nasty anti-Arab campaign, describing all members of the joint Arab list as supporters of terrorism. And Gans was ambivalent about his attitude towards the joint list. And at the last moment, actually, he decided not to rely on their support. So this is bad news for the Arabs.
There's a question from Pierre Heumann. Going back to the beginning of your talk about trust, there was some kind of a social contract between Gantz and his voters. He promised them certain things. Is there any way or legal possibilities to go against his betrayal?
I'm afraid not. I'm afraid not. But democracy is paying a price here, because it's clear that people will ask themselves when they go to elect somebody, can we trust anything that is being said to us? And if we cannot trust, why bother? Why go to elect somebody? So
you see a future drop in trust in institutions, a drop in the voting rates?
I'm afraid we are in the process of a low turnout of high support to political institutions, to the Knesset and to the government. And the lowest are the political parties from the point of view of the support of the public. And I'm afraid that this will be even reduced more. So this is a high price that the Israeli democracy is paying. And I think that there will be citizens who will say, I don't go to vote because it has no meaning.
Question from Itai Flesher. You mentioned, I think you mentioned it, that maybe that you don't think the trial against Netanyahu will ever take place. What about Litzman? Because he's also facing charges.
The same. I think that all the people who are suspected or accused, Derry, Chaim Katz, Litzman, I hope I didn't forget.
Bitan.
David Bitan.
Yeah.
He will not be a minister, David Bitan, I assume. Yeah. I think somehow they will escape liability. I have to say, this is only a speculation or an estimation. Nobody can be sure about the future.
We are wrapping up, so I'll ask you to do two things. One, to give us the worst case scenario, and one, because I don't want to leave people on Shabbat Eve with sad feelings, one, maybe an optimist one. So tell us what your fears are and what your hopes are.
Well, my fear is, actually I described my fears, so I don't want to repeat. I will say that what I'm afraid is that Netanyahu is not serious in having a government with Gans for a long period. He's using it as a step in order to pave the way for a rightist government. And I think that after Gantz is joining him, this will make it easier to people like Hendel and Yoaz Hendel and what's the name of the other guy?
Tzvi Hauser.
Tzvi Hauser, for Orly Levi Azulai, and maybe also to people from Lieberman's party to join Netanyahu in having a rightist party after having discredited Gantz and his people entirely. Nobody will ever believe a word they are saying. And such a narrow government will be really able to continue the process that is taking place in the last 10 years in different ways to make the Israeli democracy hollow. What will remain out of it would be the ceremony of elections that will continue to take place, but all other tenets of democracy will be crashed. And the government will succeed in getting absolute power, the same way that it is done in Hungary. So this is the worst case scenario. The optimistic scenario is that since we are dealing with such a serious crisis, Netanyahu will seriously put aside all his ideas about weakening the court, weakening the Knesset, etc., etc. And he will devote all his energy to the crisis. And through this government, Israel will be able to overcome the crisis. So at least in the 2 or 3 years of facing the crisis, democracy will not go back, but will remain in the same place that it is now.
On this happy note, I want to thank you, Professor Kremnitzer, for joining us. I want to thank all the journalists who participated, and Shabbat Shalom to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.